Welcome to our week 6 podcast here. This is going to be a long class and it's going to cover intelligence failure. I'm going to start looking at the intelligence failure around 9/11, look at the post 9/11 intelligence reforms, and see what the issue is, why we still have these problems, whether it's underwear bomber, Fort Hood, Boston, Congressional or Capitol Hill riot. Despite the millions, billions, trillions, depending on how you count it, expenditures that we've done. So let me start off with, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? And before I go into ask that question, I want to talk about schools of intelligence failure. And I'm going to get into this in detail. But there are generally 5 schools. One is the traditional school, is that intelligence failures occur because there is too much information. That analysts are overwhelmed, and only after the fact do you know which is the important information. What are the proverbial dots to connect? Many people say that this was the 9/11 failure. Is that, yeah, you could say that there's this bit of data, this bit of data, but there was just too much information coming in, and analysts couldn't sift through it to get the golden nuggets. So that's one school. The other school is the organizational failure. I should tell you I have a little bit of bias. I think 9/11 falls under this. And this argues that, yes, there was enough information within our government, but information wasn't funneled to the right people at the right time. Due to bureaucracy, due to classification issues, due to, I send information up to the guy who cuts my paycheck and writes my evaluation, but I'm not sending information horizontally because they're not in my chain of command. So that's the organizational theory. The third is the contrarian. This argues, no, there's not enough information out there. You didn't collect enough information to actually put this together. There's not enough collection assets out there. And you can make this argument with 9/11 as well. And then there's a series of schools of failure that look at, there was enough information, it was analyzed correctly, it just wasn't briefed to the policymakers, the guys who can make decisions well enough. And you saw this in the National Geographic, where it was briefed that Biden determined to attack in the United States, but what is George Bush supposed to do with that information? That's the argument, is that there was enough information, just where it fell down is where the policymaker and the intelligence was not briefed to the policymaker. And then we'll talk about the 5th school of information. This is the Sharma school. This argues that intelligence wasn't pushed enough to allow policymakers to mitigate risk. And we'll talk about that in a second. I want to bring that up in the discussion. What could have been done at the right time that was reasonable, that could have stopped the 9/11? Invading Afghanistan is not reasonable prior to 9/11. Grounding all commercial aviation is not reasonable. What could have been done to implement reasonable mitigation circumstances? And I'm going to ask that question over and over and over again, whether it was the case studies you read about this week or whether we talk about Capitol Hill next week. What were reasonable mitigation circumstances? So was 9/11 an intelligence failure? You can make the argument that no, it was not an intelligence failure, that we live in a world where there's a shadowy group of terrorists and it's a free country. It's not a military adversary. Not everything bad that happens is an intelligence failure. So you can make the argument that it was not an intelligence failure. I, on the other hand, think it was, because we had the information of 2 known Al-Qaeda operatives. We had that information in our government, and it was not disseminated to the right people. And the NSA documentary covers that in detail. So I'll let you decide whether it was intelligence failure or not. There's just some key points about 9/11 that we're going to talk in detail. That caused 9/11. You had the general aviation security, or lack of aviation security. There was no TSA at the time. There was no real intelligence-driven aviation security model. All the security folks are rent-a-cop, making minimum wage. So that was a big issue. You had the FBI memo talking about investigating Arabs in flight schools. That was ignored. You had Osama bin Laden having free access to Afghanistan. We're going to talk about that in a second, but if you want to conduct a 9/11 plot, something as complicated as a 9/11 plot, you need to have sanctuary. And bin Laden had lots of sanctuary in Afghanistan prior to 9/11. You had the two members watch listed, as you saw in the NSA documentary, as well as the signals intelligence on that safe house in Yemen. That's brought up in the NSA documentary. And then you had local law enforcement unaware of this intelligence. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the DHS fusion centers. So that covers kind of 9/11. We're going to talk about some of the 9/11 recommendations about national intelligence centers and the National Counterterrorism Center and trusted information networks in class in depth. We're going to then move on to DHS fusion centers. I think somebody works in the fusion centers in this class. And we're going to argue, are they worth it? It's a lot of money spent on the fusion centers. $1 billion to set up and hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain and man and staff. Are we getting our dollars worth out of it? And we'll bring that up. What are the advantages and disadvantages? We'll then go on to the post 9/11 case studies. The first will be Fort Hood. And the question is, how did this happen? How did the Fort Hood case happen? What were the causes? And there's two failures. One, you had Hassan's history, as you read about, a guy who was pledging loyalty to Islam, openly questioned whether Muslims could fight in the Iraq War and Afghanistan, and justified suicide bombing. On the flip side, you also had his communications with Anwar al-Awlaki. Because of stovepipes, his chain of command knew about his history, but didn't know about his communications with Anwar al-Awlaki. On the other side, the JTTF knew about his communications, but didn't know about his histories. If you put those together, you probably have a profile of Hassan that possibly could arrest, but maybe at least raise suspicion. So you had those two issues, two pieces of information that were differentiated. And questions we're going to ask: does radicalization deserve further scrutiny? At what point, whether it's in this case or whether it's in other cases, do we scrutinize people? When do they cross a line that they did go onto lists? What's constitutionally protected free speech and what isn't? And even if we had, and then the final question is, even if we had all this information, would it have made a difference? And we're going to keep asking that question, is that people are going to engage in suspicious activity, they're going to raise their profile, but there might not be enough to arrest or detain. From there, we'll go to the underwear bomber, great documentary. We'll talk about the intelligence failures, and we'll talk about problems with watch listing that were covered in the documentary, with specific focus on the intelligence failures that we knew he was bad, but he was still allowed to board the flight. With the fact that we didn't anticipate a person-born IED in the compartment of an aircraft. And then we'll cover risk-based security, and we'll talk about why I was fired from the TSA in this port. So those are the class for this week. If there's questions or issues, please let me know.